Hello, I'm Dr. Mirko Pegoraro, and this is your eighth lesson on the developmental biology module. In this lesson, we are going to talk about metamorphosis. And in particular, we're going to talk about the metamorphosis of some kind of insect and also metamorphosis in vertebrates, and using the example of frogs. So what are we going to talk about in this lesson in particular? So we will have a metamorphosis introduction. Then we are going to talk about the hormonal and morphological changes that happen in Anurans, which are the common frogs. We are also going to talk about later on about the metamorphosis events and hormonal control in holometabolous insect. Holometabolous insects are the insect like flies that have several larval stages. So just to remind you that during the last lesson we talked about the tetrapod limb development, and in the next lesson we will be talking about tissue regeneration. This particular lesson is linked to the imaginal disc practical in particular. So where are we? Well, in the last lesson, we talked about the development of the limb, the tetrapod limb. So we talked about the different parts of the limb, we talk about the anatomy of the limb, but most importantly, we talk about how the different axes are formed in the limb, in the developing limb, and we talk about the different important elements of the limb bud, including the progress zone, the zone of polarizing activity, and the apical ectodermal ridge. Okay, so let's start and talk about metamorphosis. So, what is metamorphosis? Well, metamorphosis can be defined as development on hormones. So it is the hormonal reactivation of development. In terms of how the young individuals compare to the adult individuals, we can have animals that are direct developers, like most mammals, like us, where the young individual looks a lot like the mature or the adult individual. The difference between the most important difference between the young individual and the adult individual is that the adults are sexually mature, while the young individuals are not. So we find this in most mammals, but also in most birds and reptiles. So instead of being direct developers, some animals are indirect developers, and these are the animals that include in their life cycle a larval stage. So here we are talking about many marine animals, we're talking about frogs, for instance, so some of the amphibians that have a tadpole, but also a lot of the insects that have larval stages. Now, the metamorphosis can separate two different ecological stages. So it represents metamorphosis not only represents a developmental stage, if you want, but also an ecological transition. And this is the case of this example here of this Cetropia moth. In this Cetropia moth, the caterpillar with the larva stage basically eat a lot, so it is the stage where the animal acquire energy, fat, protein, while the adult stage, so the moth after metamorphosis, do not eat at all. So they don't eat, they don't actually have the mouth part, they don't have a digestive system, and the only role of the adult is to reproduce. So in fact, there is also a difference in terms of how long the larva stage and the adult stage, in this case, live. The larva stage can endure and survive for months, while the adult will live for 1 or 2 days just to mate. So not only metamorphosis is a developmental transition, if you want, or a developmental stage, but it can be seen as well as an ecological transition, at least in some species. Now, in terms of metamorphosis, animals can also be divided in animals that have primary larvae and secondary larvae. Now, the primary larvae have the animal with primary larvae have larvae that have a body plan or body structure that is dramatically different, morphologically different compared to the adult. And this is the case of the sea urchin. In the adult sea urchin has a radial organization of the body, and it also stay usually on the bed of the sea, feeding on the bed of the sea. While the larva stage that we can see here on the left swim, so it is not like a dweller on the base of on the bed of the sea, but it actually swim around to collect food, and it has a bilateral composition, a bilateral structure. So it has a left and right side, it has an anterior-posterior side, which completely disappear after metamorphosis when the larva become a sea urchin adult, which has a radial organization of the body. Compare this to the secondary larva. So most insects have a secondary larva. Most holometabolous insects have a secondary larva. And animals that have a secondary larva, in the animal with secondary larva, the larva body plan is already very similar to the adult body plan. What does it mean? It means that in the larva anterior-posterior axis is the same in the adult. So the anterior-posterior axis is already determined in the larva, and it will be maintained in the adult, as well as the dorsoventral axis and the bilateral axis. So the main body organization are already established in the larva and are maintained in the adult even after metamorphosis. Okay, let's talk about initially, or let's start to talk about vertebrate metamorphosis. And when we talk about vertebrate metamorphosis, one of the animals that we want to talk about, one group of animals that we want to talk about are amphibians. In fact, amphibian, the word amphibian means double life. Why double life? Well, double life because their larva stages live in the water, so in the aquatic world, while the adult stage after metamorphosis is prepared to move to a terrestrial life. So it moves from living just in the water to move and live also in the land. So double life, it means that the animal is able to move from one style of living, which is similar to fish, to another style of living, which is similar to other land-dwelling animals. And amphibians are divided in two groups, the urodels and the anurans. In the urodels, which are basically the salamanders kind of animals, the metamorphosis is not so dramatic. Here we have a pre-metamorphic animal and compared to a post-metamorphic salamander. As you can see, the main difference regards the resorption of portion of the tail, so the tail fin that provide locomotion in the metamorphic animal. Now it is removed, and we have like a solid tail, very similar to other terrestrial animals. Obviously, the gills disappear; they are removed from the animal, and the skin change as well. They change structure, and of course, this is because the animal now will at least partially live on land. So the skin and the exchange of gases need to be controlled differently compared to when the animal just live on water. However, the metamorphosis in urodels are not, as I mentioned before, is not so dramatic, and definitely not as dramatic as we see in Anurans. Anurans are frogs, basically. And as you know, the frogs have a tadpole stage, so they produce eggs. From the eggs come out their larvae, which are the tadpole, and after a while, the tadpole undergo metamorphosis and become the adult frog. The changes that happen during metamorphosis to the tadpole regard almost every organ of the animal. and these changes are driven by thyroid hormones, which of course they are produced in the thyroid, which is a gland, and these hormones are released in the bloodstream. And the hormones here that are important is the thyroxine T4 hormone, which can be converted in the active form of 3-iodothyronine or T3. What do they cause? So these hormones cause different events in the body of the animal or the tadpole. They can cause growth, so we have growth of new limbs, for example, in the tadpole. We have cell death, for example, part of the tail is part of the cells of the tails are destroyed by apoptosis and they die. Remodeling, so some of the organs of the tadpole are changed and restructured. For example, the intestine change, and this is because the tadpole tend to be herbivores, so they tend to eat mostly plant, while the adult tend to be eating other animals, so they become carnivores. So the intestine need to change from a mostly herbivore diet to a more carnivore diet. We also have respecification, and this is happening, for example, in the liver in the animal, because now with a new behavior, so moving on land, we need different enzymes to work in the liver for digestion of different food, but also because of production of different waste material. Now, let's have a look on some of the morphological changes that occurs in tadpoles during metamorphosis. Please notice how the thyroid hormone, T3, are inducing different kind of events, so different kind of things in different parts of the body. So we will discuss about this for the first part of today's lesson. So the T3, the thyroid hormone, the active form of the thyroid hormone, induce a growth of new structures in a specific part of the body of the tadpole. You can see here in this picture on the left the tadpole that grow already some limbs. So for example, the limbs grow only on specific part of the body of the animal, but the tadpole also grow eyelids. Obviously, the eyes in the tadpole do not require eyelids because they are of course in water, and the water moisturizes continuously, obviously, the eyes and clean them continuously. So the eyelids are not necessary. But as an adult, the frog that goes around on land require lids to keep moisturize the eyes and to clean them. So lids are formed, limbs are formed, but only in specific region of the body. T3 also induced the formation of new neurons from the spinal cord, and this of course makes total sense, because if we produce new muscle, for example the muscle of the limb, we also need innervation so that the brain can control those muscles. Without innervation, the muscle will just be there and not be able to be controlled. So T3 induced the proliferation of new neurons from the spinal cord to innervate the new structure that have been formed. Another important event that happened to the tadpole during metamorphosis and suggest a change in behavior and diet is that the eyes of the tadpole that are on a lateral position, typical of herbivores, because the lateral position of the eyes allow the animal to have almost a 360-degree vision around them, so if predators are coming they can see them. So the tadpole eyes move forward and point straight. Basically, the adult frog acquire a binocular field of vision. This position of the eye in this binocular field of vision is typical of predatory animals. This because the animal from mostly being an herbivore now become mostly being a carnivore. So it start to predate insect or other kind of prey. So far we saw some movement of organs, we saw some production of new organs. However, T3 also induced some structure to die. So this is quite interesting from if you think about it, because T3 is inducing overgrowth of some structure, but the same signal T3 is inducing some other structure to die. For example, the tail is going to die and to be resorbed as well. The gills or the tadpole are going to be removed. In the tails, T3 is inducing apoptosis of some part of the tail. So apoptosis, if you don't remember, is the program cell death. So this means that the cells are going to die, they die alone, they activate an internal program to kill themselves. However, not all the tail is removed by apoptosis, and in fact, most part of the tail is removed by the action of macrophages. The macrophages are part of the live in the blood. So these are cells that are part of the immune system of the animal, and usually, and the job the macrophages are going around the body to remove debris, bacteria that die, or viruses, debris that have been killed by the immune system, or cells as well that are dying in the body. Another thing that happens is that the macrophages in the liver and spleen digest the blood cells with larva hemoglobin. Yes, because now during metamorphosis, the adult acquire a new version of hemoglobin. So it produces red blood cell with a new adult version of hemoglobin that bind oxygen more slowly than the larva version, but releasing more quickly. So this is an hemoglobin that is good for living on land, while the larva hemoglobin was good for living in water. So the macrophages will remove those red blood cells that have the larva hemoglobin and allowed the blood to be enriched with the red blood cells with the adult hemoglobin. Some tissue, of course, are remodeled, so reorganized, so they don't disappear, but they are simply reorganized. This is the case of the intestine. So although most of the intestinal epithelial cells die during metamorphosis, some are surviving and they are redifferentiating or de-differentiating and producing a new kind of intestine that is more apt to the digestion of the new source of food, which is mostly animal protein. Neurons that are there in the tadpole, for example, some neurons that are there to innervate the tongue, they're still there, they're already there in the tadpole, but they're not functional because there is not a tongue there's not a tongue in the tadpole. But the adult produce a tongue during metamorphosis, and so the neurons they are producing new synapses to innervate the muscles that are formed. Another interesting thing is that, of course, tadpoles have a lateral line. Lateral line are organs that are present in most fish along the two bilateral sides of the body, and these are organs that sense change in pressure of the water, so the fish knows if something is approaching from the side to perhaps eat them. So this lateral line degenerates during metamorphosis, and it is remodeled to produce the ears. It is remodeled, and the ears are produced in the developing adult. Finally, another important change is that the tadpole school is changing shape and become an adult shaped school, but also the material of the bones of the tadpole change. The tadpole, in fact, is the tadpole bones, and the tadpole skull is made mostly of cartilage. However, during metamorphosis, this cartilage is turned into bones. So the adult will have a different kind of skull compared to the tadpole. However, the skull of the adult derives directly from the tadpole skull, but also the material of the skull of the adult will be bone instead of cartilage. Now, one important event, all metamorphic events are important, but one important event that happens in the liver of the tadpole is the production of a new pathway of new metabolic pathway associated with the terrestrial life. So basically, the biochemistry of the liver changed during metamorphosis. So the tadpole, and this is induced, of course, by the thyroid hormones. These thyroid hormones induce new pathway to be expressed, new protein, new enzyme to be expressed in the liver. Now, the tadpole produce ammonia in the urine, so it is amnotelic. So it is amnotelic. So ammonia is a molecule that is very toxic for cells, for biology, for biological organs. But the tadpoles can afford to produce ammonia because, like the other fishes, they release ammonia in a large quantity of water. So, of course, water is not a problem for animals that live in water because they are surrounded by it. So there is never an absence of water. So they can use as a waste material ammonia, even though it is very toxic. However, when the animal become now a terrestrial individual, terrestrial animal, on land, lack of water is always a problem. And so this is why the skin, for example, of salamander need to change to be able to conserve more water and to lose less water through gas exchanges. In the frog, the same thing happened. One way to control loss of water is to change from producing ammonia to producing urea as a waste material. So they become ureotelic. So instead of amnotelic, they become ureotelic. The adult frogs become ureotelic. So how this happens? Well, during metamorphosis, some genes that are inactive in the tadpole become active in the adult. So a new pathway is activating the adult. The pathway converts ammonia, NH3, into urea. So this pathway takes CO2 and ammonia and convert it to urea. Urea is less toxic than ammonia and requires less water to be removed. So there is less loss of water to remove waste material.